Despite the USA being part of almost every major war in modern times, the Vietnam conflict still holds the position for the biggest and toughest challenge for the American Army yet. Unlike the European front, for which the American Marines and soldiers were trained, Vietnam offered an entirely alien territory. There was no war front to advance, no safe region to defend, not even a well-defined theater in which to operate. Vietnam War soldiers endured many hardships and faced many problems. While most of these challenges could be explained, some didn't make any sense. These inexplicable mysteries are still creeping in the minds of veterans, experts, and the historians of the Vietnam War.
I know I've heard it said that in the Second World War, the combat veteran had maybe 40 days in combat, whereas us guys in Vietnam, we had about 240 days out of our 1 year that we spent there.
Welcome to Nutty History, and today, let's take a look at the creepy mysteries of the Vietnam War, which are still baffling the world. Viewer discretion is advised for this video, as some of this video may be offensive or disturbing. We, the makers of this video, in no way support or condone the actions of the subjects featured. Vietnam wasn't just unfamiliar, but it was also a daunting terrain for the American Marines. So they needed help from locals and South Vietnamese soldiers to guide them in the area of operations. Those who were not sympathetic toward the Viet Cong's cause or didn't know any better were willing to help the Marines through the difficult topography of Vietnam. But even for them, some parts of those dark, dense forests were too much. These locals would talk of creatures unnatural and terrifying that were not meant to be confronted. These people were talking of phantoms, reanimated corpses, and flying shadows. Of course, the Marines didn't take any of that into account and shrugged off the warnings, considering them third world folklores. But going into the action, it all became very real, very fast. The woods of Vietnam challenged the sanity of the American troops. The heat, the humidity, the dark woods, the psychological warfare with the Viet Cong forced them to face uncharted stress, anxiety, and terror of war like never before. Moreover, opium was spreading through the American troops like wildfire. Being hopped up and marching through haunting woods did no favor to the Marines. There were reports of ghostly figures moving paranormally through the trees. More reports featured fanged humanoids with black eyes that would try to abduct unsuspecting troops. Scared out of their wits, certain soldiers complained about beasts that were seemingly bulletproof. Men of the U.S. 1st Marine Division testified of encountering a giant woman with bat-like wings and skin black as a shadow. Earl Morrison, who witnessed the creature as close as 10 feet while on night duty, said that the winged woman emitted a strange glow as it came closer to the men before flying away from the camp. Some believe that the fear of these creatures was the cause behind the American military using Agent Orange and napalm instead of manned incursions into the woods. Since the triple canopy jungle kept the sunlight from hitting them, there was no telling what time of day it was in the woods. For Marines, the Vietnam War was always fought in darkness, and so shadows easily found ways to scare the living daylights out of soldiers. Flight 739 disappeared somewhere between Guam and the Philippines on March 16, 1962, and there was never a trace found. There was no wreckage, no records, and after 2 months of no clue of the whereabouts of the plane, the 107 passengers of the concerned flight were declared deceased. Now you must be wondering how that connects back to the Vietnam War. Families of the victims that were aboard the missing plane claimed that the 107 men on the unfortunate flight were soldiers deployed to the Vietnam War. Interestingly, the official record of the flight states that the plane has nothing to do with the war effort, and until now there haven't been any word from any official government department confirming that the men on board had anything to do with any military mission. The government files do validate that some of the men on the vanished flight were either communication advisors or supply sergeants, but family members of the victims claim otherwise. They point to a list of hand-picked mission members that were assembled from military bases across the country. Also, certain files about the passengers and the flight that were given to the family members of the victims were heavily redacted. The report by the Civil Aeronautics Board claims that the plane was in fact heading for Saigon. It had no cargo, and it was carrying 93 Americans, 3 personnel from South Vietnam's military, and the rest were the crew. The eerie element of the incident is that there was never a distress signal. Nobody from the plane tried to establish radio communication, and there was no report of anything ominous either. The plane just stopped responding. A Liberian tanker reported an explosion that they witnessed along the plane's flight path, but an investigation found no crash site, no sign of an explosion, no remains, and no sign of disturbance at all. The family members of the missing soldiers have been trying to get the names of victims on the Vietnam Memorial Wall in Washington, but eerily, the authorities have been silent on the subject matter.
Flight 739 was scheduled with 2 flight crews, a captain, first officer, second officer, 2 flight engineers, and 2 navigators, 4 cabin crew, and they had 96 passengers for a flight from Travis Air Force Base in California to Saigon in South Vietnam. 93 of the passengers were jungle-trained Army Rangers, primarily highly trained in electronics and communications. The other 3 were members of the Armed Forces of Vietnam. The flight crew, 5 men and 4 women, were all civilians.
The outcome of the Vietnam War might have been starkly different if a certain Trinh Minh Tay would have survived a sniper's attempt in 1955. Now, if you're scratching your head about why this scrawny-looking fellow who looks like a college freshman was so crucial to the fate of the Vietnam conflict and the Cold War, well, allow us to introduce him. Trinh Minh Tay was trained in military officer school by the Japanese Kempeitai when Japan began using Cao Wei Dai military troops. By 1945, he was an officer in the Cao Wei Dai militia, roughly at the age of only 25. Trinh Minh Tay served as a non-commissioned police officer in the Japanese military throughout the Second World War and became a Cao Wei Dai military leader during the end of the First Indochina War. He served that role at the beginning of the Vietnam War as well. The time with Japanese Kempeitai cemented anti-communist and anti-colonialist ideology in Trinh Minh Tay. After the Second World War concluded, he joined the French Army to be part of the Association for the Restoration of Vietnam. But he defected in 1951, along with thousands of supporters, to create the Union of Nationalist Forces of Vietnam. The third contender in the fight for Vietnam was supposed to go against both the Viet Cong and the Western Front. However, it is believed Trinh Minh Tay was under extreme pressure to align with the South Vietnamese Army by his financial backers. But before that could have panned out, Trinh Minh Tay was taken out on a Saigon street by a sniper in 1955. The identity of the sniper is still a mystery, and no one knows why he was eliminated or who ordered it. There's also been much speculation on how his alliance with South Vietnam would have turned the course of the war. But was such an arrangement really on the paper? That secret too has died with Trinh Minh Tay. George W. Bush's military service was dragged into the spotlight during his election campaign in 2000 and 2004 as well. The attention brought to the records highlighted the sketchy elements, and certain parts of it being missing created a hotbed of speculation. Also, certain parts of these records contradict themselves. The payroll records seem to project that W reported for duty at Ellington Air Force Base in 1973, but the medical reports dating the same date, May 2nd, does not seem to agree. More records have indicated that his attendance at the Air Force Base in Texas was dodgy at best. It wasn't just a matter of being on and off, he was actively trying to get a transfer, which was initially declined, but was finally approved anyway. His qualifications were not at best either. A far cry from the accolades that superior officers later showered on him, calling him an exemplary and dedicated pilot. There's also the question of the year, wherein his whereabouts are not accounted for at all. It is also evident that his celebrity status, unlike his service logs, were well documented. Even his commanding officers arranged to have pictures shaking his hand. So there is a question mark at the end of the sentence. Did America's former president receive preferential treatment to get out of the worst fighting of the Vietnam War and into pilot training? Later, he would say that he was denied overseas deployment, but just what went on behind the scenes still isn't quite clear. As much as Americans were spooked by the ghost stories, they also tried to take advantage of Vietnamese superstitions. With the help of South Vietnamese volunteers, American military personnel recorded some incredibly eerie voices that were then played throughout the jungles. The tape, which is now infamous as Ghost Tape Number 10 and is available on YouTube, was widely used under Operation Wandering Soul. But did it really strike fear in the hearts and souls of enemies? Well, the results are considered dubious at best. Some assert that the tape had absolutely no effect on the Viet Cong and they easily saw through the ruse. However, other reports endorse its success in at least leeching away some of the enemy's morale. But some reports do mention that the tape terrified the Viet Cong so methodically that they abandoned their post and yielded. The real truth is still somewhere in the jungles of Vietnam. Would you dare to explore for yourself? War can do strange things to people. The horrors of battle leave mental and physical scars that some people never recover from. Throughout history, there have been battles that have turned the tides, that have decided what country or empire would go on to dominate the world. Even battles that changed what languages were spoken in entire regions. But there have also been battles with unexplained phenomena. Entire legions disappearing, ghost planes, stuff that simply hasn't been explained. From Bigfoot in Vietnam to a battle stopped by a meteor, to one that was fought against UFOs, here are some of the creepiest mysteries of the world's greatest battles. Foo Fighters, not the band. You might have heard about the US government's recently declassified documents surrounding unidentified flying objects, which they like to call unidentified aerial phenomenon. It was a whole thing.
There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the ASA. My gosh. They're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots from the west. Look at that thing, dude.
Part of the drama was the fact that several Air Force pilots reportedly saw strange objects in the sky moving in ways that defied physics. Well, back before there were cameras on aircraft, pilots during World War II, they were apparently seeing the same types of things all around Europe. The strange objects that they were seeing were called Foo Fighters, a term coined by a radar operator in the U.S. Air Force 415th Night Fighter Squadron, and not in fact the band. Dave Grohl wasn't even born yet. According to reports in 1944, Donald J. Myers saw 8 to 10 bright orange lights in the sky as he was flying with the rest of his crew. They dipped and dived in ridiculous ways. They disappeared and appeared later miles away. Myers and the rest of the crew were dumbfounded. Myers would later nickname the unexplained objects Foo Fighters, which was just a nonsense word used in a popular comic strip at the time called Smokey Stover. Over the course of the war, Axis and Allied pilots alike kept seeing these unexplained things in the sky. The sightings varied in appearance and behavior, but most were described as glowing spheres or orbs of light that would follow planes, sometimes for quite a while. Some reports describe the objects as having a metallic appearance or making a humming sound, just like the most recent sightings that have received a lot of press in recent years. These World War II versions were also able to perform maneuvers that were impossible for known aircraft at the time, such as sudden changes in direction or rapid acceleration. And they appeared in one of the most significant battles of the war, the Battle of the Bulge. Fought towards the end of the war in December 1944, it was the largest and a brutal battle fought by the U.S. Army. It was also the last major German offensive campaign of the war. During the battle, a few Allied pilots reported seeing our strange Foo Fighters. They were apparently seen all over the place over the course of the battle, confusing and mystifying both sides. Now, according to reports, the Foo Fighters appeared as glowing balls of light that would follow the planes, darting and zigzagging through the sky. The objects were often described as being red, orange, or green, and were said to be able to keep up with the planes despite their high speeds and rapid maneuvers. In some cases, the objects would suddenly disappear without any explanation. The sightings were reported by pilots from different units and were taken seriously enough by the military that an investigation was launched. But despite their best efforts, no one could figure out exactly what the objects were. Some people thought the objects might have been some kind of secret weapon, being tested out by Germans, while others, unsurprisingly, brought up possible extraterrestrial origins. In the years since the war, more possible explanations have been floated out there, including ball lightning and possible psychological hallucinations due to the stress of battle and fatigue, experienced by the pilots during long flights. Are the Foo Fighters the same mysterious objects that are still being seen today? And a more pressing question, can Dave Grohl write a song about them? The Battle of Los Angeles, not the Rage Against the Machine album. The Battle of Los Angeles might just be the only battle in history fought between one side and apparently nobody. Coming off the heels of Pearl Harbor, the US was understandably a bit paranoid about another Japanese attack, but they went a bit off the rails a few months later when they began firing at nobody. Here's what went down.
Costly to our Navy was the loss of war vessels, airplanes, and equipment. But more costly to Japan was the effectiveness of its foul attack in immediately unifying America in its determination to fight and win the war thrust upon it, and to win the peace that will follow.
It all started on the night of February 24, 1942. It was just a few months after the surprise Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and American paranoia was at a pretty justified high. At some point, though, someone thought they saw something. The commanding general of the Western Defense Command, General John L. DeWitt, ordered a blackout of the city and the mobilization of anti-aircraft defenses in response to reports of an enemy attack. The air raid siren sounded, and searchlights scanned the sky in search of enemy aircraft. At around 2:30 a.m., radar operators reported an unidentified target approaching the city from the ocean. The target was apparently also spotted by observers on the ground, and anti-aircraft guns began firing at it. Over the course of the next few hours, more than 1,400 rounds of artillery were spat out at the alleged object, lighting up the sky and causing widespread panic among LA's residents. Despite the intense barrage of artillery, no evidence of any enemy aircraft was ever found, and the actual case of the incident remains a mystery. Some eyewitnesses reported seeing multiple objects in the sky, while others claimed that the object was a single large craft. The event was initially reported as an enemy air raid by the U.S. military and the media, with some newspapers even claiming that a Japanese aircraft had been shot down. But this was just a World War II version of today's fake news. It was later revealed that no enemy planes had been detected on radar, and there was no evidence of any aircraft wreckage or debris. Theories about what actually happened during this one-way battle have swirled over the years. Some think that the incident was a case of mass hysteria brought on by the fear and uncertainty of the war. Others suggest that the object seen in the sky may have been a weather balloon, a misidentified aircraft, or even a secret military experiment. There are still some who think the Battle of Los Angeles was actually connected to the Pearl Harbor attack, and that the object seen in the sky was actually a Japanese aircraft sent to bomb the city. There really isn't much concrete evidence to support this theory, but some have pointed to reports of Japanese submarines off the coast of California around the time of the incident, which leads to possible evidence of a Japanese presence in the area. There were, in fact, Japanese subs off the coast of California. Just a day before the mysterious Battle of Los Angeles, they had fired a few shells at an oil refinery in Elwood oil field off the coast of Santa Barbara. The attack only caused minor damage, but it probably contributed to the mysterious ghost battle that occurred the next night. Hannibal's Ghost. Hannibal was perhaps one of the greatest Carthaginian generals in history. The Carthaginians were experts at dissevering up an opposing army, as Hannibal from Silence of the Lambs was at cutting up the meat of lambs. They were lambs, right? Definitely not people, right? The filet mignon of Hannibal's, the General Hannibal's career, probably came in 216 at the Battle of Cannae in what's now southeast Italy during the Second Punic War. The battle has gone down as one of the greatest tactical masterpieces in military history. Hannibal's army was significantly outnumbered by the Roman forces, with estimates ranging from 50,000 to 80,000 Roman soldiers against approximately 40,000 Carthaginians. To make matters worse, Hannibal's army was made up of a mix of soldiers from different cultures and nations with varying levels of experience and training. But Hannibal's strategic genius allowed him to turn these disadvantages into strength. He knew that the Romans relied heavily on their infantry, so he hatched a plan to draw the Romans into a trap by using his cavalry and light infantry to lure them into a large enclosed space with their flanks exposed. Gotta watch those flanks. A tactic that Genghis Khan and the Mongols would mirror more than a millennium later as they rampage across Asia, albeit mostly all on horseback. Once the Romans were trapped, Hannibal ordered his infantry to close in on the Roman lines from all sides, surrounding and crushing them. The Roman infantry, with their heavy armor and weapons, couldn't maneuver in the tight space and were put to cease en masse. It's estimated that up to 70,000 Roman soldiers were killed or captured, and only a few thousand managed to escape. It was a remarkable victory, but the strange part is the legend that sprang up afterwards, called the legend of Hannibal's ghost. Maybe feeling a bit butthurt by their defeat, the Romans created a legend that goes like this. Every 216 years, the ghost of the famed Carthaginian general comes back to haunt the site of the Battle of Cannae. According to the legend, Hannibal is cursed to wander the battlefield until the planet Saturn completes a full orbit. It's based on the ancient Roman belief in the influence of the 7 classical planets on human affairs, which included Saturn. In Roman astronomy, it was believed that Saturn's orbit took about 29.5 years, so the number 216 was arrived at by multiplying the length of Saturn's orbit by the number of classical planets, including the Sun and Moon. The legend goes on to say that on the anniversary of the battle, which is August 2nd, Hannibal's ghost can be seen riding a white horse along the banks of the river that runs through the battlefield, with his army of ghosts following behind him. It's also said that if anyone sees Hannibal's ghost, they're doomed to enter the afterworld soon afterward. The battle that changed language. What if I told you that there was a battle that changed the course of language throughout the European continent? Seems like an important battle, right? One whose site would be known and marked for its significance. Unfortunately, we don't know where this battle took place, but its aftershock is still felt and spoken today. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest in 8 AD was one of the worst defeats in Roman history, and it's seen as a turning point in the Roman Empire's relationship with the Germanic people. The battle was fought in Teutoburg Forest, a dense forested area in what's now Germany. The Roman forces were marching to consolidate their control over the region, but they were caught off guard by an ambush by the Germanic tribes. The defeat of the Battle of Teutoburg Forest had pretty significant consequences for the Roman Empire. The Romans were forced to abandon their plans to annex the Germanic territories, and instead, they focused on securing their existing borders. The Roman Empire's northern expansion was effectively halted, and this allowed Germanic and Scandinavian languages to continue to develop and spread throughout the region instead of Latin. If the Roman forces had not been defeated that day, there's a good chance that people in Scandinavia and Germany could be speaking Italian today. And there's even the butterfly effect type possibility that English would not have spread the way it did. Despite its significance, the exact location of the Battle of Teutoburg Forest remains a mystery. The dense forested area and lack of written records from the Germanic tribes make it difficult to figure out exactly where the battle took place. Archaeologists and historians continue to search for the location of the battle, but it remains undiscovered to this day. The Lost Legion. How do 6,000 soldiers simply disappear? Do they all decide that war isn't worth it and walk off into the sunset, never to be heard from again? Are they defeated so soundly that their bodies are never recovered and the battlefield is lost to history? Or is it something more mundane, like a 2,000-year-old lapse in paperwork? The disappearance of Rome's Ninth Legion has been a topic of mystery and speculation for centuries. The story of the Lost Legion was popularized by the historical novel The Eagle of the Ninth by Rosemary Sutcliffe back in 1954. Now, according to the novel, the Ninth Legion was stationed in Britain in the 2nd century AD and was led by a young Roman officer named Marcus Aquila. In AD 117, the legion marched north of Hadrian's Wall, the northernmost boundary of Roman Britain, and disappeared without a trace. Marcus Aquila, the main character of the book, sets out on a quest to find out what happened to the legion and recover its lost eagle standard. There is certain historical evidence that implies the Ninth Legion did vanish in Britain right about 117 AD, despite the fact that the book is fiction. The Roman historian Tacitus mentioned in his book Annals that the legion was lost in a campaign against the Caledonians, the people inhabiting modern-day Scotland. But the actual fate of the Ninth Legion is still debated among historians. Some have suggested that the legion was actually just transferred to another part of the Roman Empire and its disappearance was exaggerated and misunderstood, kind of like how Paul Bunyan grew into a giant. Others have speculated that the legion were killed in battle or suffered from disease or starvation. In recent years, archaeological evidence has shed some light on the fate of the Ninth Legion. Inscriptions at an old Roman legionary base in the Netherlands suggest that the Ninth might have been stationed there after 120 AD. One of them simply says that the legion was there. Another refers to a soldier from the Ninth who was stationed there. A third mentions the legion by name and says that it participated in some campaigns in the region. Dating inscriptions that are nearly 2,000 years old to prove that the legion was or wasn't there before or after 120 AD is a tricky thing though, and questions still swirl. Other archaeological evidence has suggested that the Ninth Legion may have been sent to the Middle East or other parts of the Roman Empire. But there's still no concrete answer as to what happened to the Legion, and the mystery remains unsolved. The Vanished Battalion. A more modern version of the Lost Legion took place during World War I. This time a lot fewer men went missing, but it happened a little over 100 years ago as opposed to nearly 2,000 years ago. The mystery of Celtic Wood, as it's become known, might be the most mysterious case of soldiers gone missing in modern warfare. It started with the Battle of Polkapelle, which was fought on October 9, 1917 in Belgium. During the battle, the 10th Battalion of the Australian Imperial Force was assigned to capture the heavily defended Celtic Wood near the village of Passchendaele in Flanders. The 10th Battalion managed to capture the wood but suffered heavy casualties in the process. The battalion was then ordered to hold the position against German counterattacks. But when backup came to relieve them, they found no sign of the battalion. 71 men had disappeared, leaving behind only abandoned equipment and empty trenches. And that 71 is depending on who you believe. Other reports claim that 37 men disappeared. The discrepancy has been chalked up to clerical errors in reporting missing soldiers. Apparently, the term missing can be interpreted in different ways on the battlefield. Some reports may have used the term to refer only to soldiers whose bodies could not be recovered, while others may have included soldiers who were captured or lost in the chaos of battle. Searches of the area were conducted, but no trace of the 10th was found. Some soldiers reported hearing faint cries for help coming from underground, leading to speculation that the battalion had been put to premature burial in German countermines. But later searches of the area didn't uncover any evidence of this. To this day, the fate of the soldiers of the 10th Battalion remains a mystery. Theories abound, ranging from the battalion being captured and killed by the Germans to the possibility that they were simply lost in the chaos of battle. However, despite extensive investigations, no conclusive evidence has ever been found to explain their disappearance. Vietnamese Bigfoot? Bigfoot gets around. Sightings of the legendary creature inhabit the folklore of countries all over the world. You've got Bigfoot/Sasquatch in North America. You've got the Yeti in the Himalayas, the Yowie in Australia, the Almas in the Caucasus. There are even rainforest versions, the Mapinguari in the Amazon, and the Orang Pendek in Indonesia. And there were apparently multiple sightings of one in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. The creature in question has been dubbed the Rock Ape, or the Batutut. They've been described as being roughly human-sized and covered in reddish brown or black fur, and stalk the jungles of Vietnam. Most of the sightings of these mysterious rock apes were by U.S. troops stationed in the jungles during the war, and they reportedly made cameos in a couple of battles, including the Battle of Tam Quan in 1965 and the Battle of Quezon in 1968. But one of the strangest accounts came from a 1966 battle at a place called Hill 868 in Quang Nam Province. The Marine unit stationed there reportedly saw movement in the brush nearby, and assumed it was Viet Cong, but it quickly became clear that it was a group of 6-foot-tall ape-like creatures covered in hair, with long arms and muscles that would make Arnold Schwarzenegger blush. Things get weirder from here. Instead of using the guns they clearly had available, the soldiers, for whatever reason, decided it was a better idea to throw rocks at the rock apes. The plan backfired though, as the rock apes picked up the rocks and started throwing them back at the soldiers, who were forced to retreat. When support arrived, they found a bunch of injured soldiers and apparently a couple of rock apes, but there's no photographic evidence that they actually ever existed. In any event, the incident became known as the Battle of Dong Dinh. It's a story that has been told and retold by soldiers who served in Vietnam, but there isn't much hard evidence to support its veracity. Some have suggested that the creatures may have been misidentified or mutated primates, while others believe it could have been soldiers in makeshift ghillie suits. Whatever they were, the story of the Battle of Dong Dinh has become part of the lore of the Vietnam War and the legends of the rock ape. There are also stories that the rock ape is a supernatural creature, with some Vietnamese soldiers believing that they were guarding sacred sites in the jungle. Some U.S. soldiers even reported that the rock ape had supernatural powers, like the ability to disappear or to create illusions, kind of like an abracadabra thing. Pearl Harbor Mysteries. These next two are mysteries surrounding the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Well, one of them's a mystery. The other is what you could call an eerie premonition. Maybe one of the only things more frightening than a battle is the fact that someone can predict exactly how that battle would unfold. Let's start with the guy who predicted the Pearl Harbor attack. Lieutenant Pete Ellis was a Marine Corps officer that had a reputation for being unconventional and unorthodox. He was stationed in Guam in 1915, and in the 1920s he began studying the Pacific and the Japanese, convinced that the U.S. would one day be drawn into a war with Japan. Ellis traveled extensively throughout the Pacific, studying the culture, language, and military tactics of Japan. In 1921, Ellis wrote a report called Advanced Base Operations in Micronesia, which outlined a scenario for a surprise Japanese attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet anchored in Pearl Harbor. Unfortunately, Ellis's predictions were not taken seriously at the time. He was a bit of a drunk and suffered from nervous breakdowns and severe depression, so his superiors eventually tagged him with the crazy card. They relieved him of his duties, and they sent him to a mental hospital. He died there in 1923 at the age of 42, never knowing that his predictions were deadly accurate. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, Ellis's report was rediscovered and it was found to be remarkably accurate. The report predicted the time and location of the attack, the use of aircraft carriers, and the tactics employed by the Japanese. It's now considered to be one of the most important intelligence reports in American history. In addition to Pearl Harbor, Ellis also basically predicted the entirety of World War II's Pacific Theater, nearly 20 years before it happened. To top it off, he's also been dubbed the prophet of amphibious warfare for his work developing the tactics that were eventually used in World War II. Some of the craziest people are often the most brilliant. Then there's the story of the mysterious ghost plane that appeared in the sky and then crashed near Pearl Harbor a year and a day after the infamous attacks. At first, radar operators were concerned that the aircraft was Japanese, but it was a lone plane flying in a way that could only be described as aimless. When intercepting planes went out to investigate, they found out that it was actually an American P-40, the same type of plane that was used by the U.S. to defend Pearl Harbor the year prior. It was in bad shape. It was riddled with bullets, it didn't have landing gear. The intercepting pilots reportedly saw the pilot of the derelict aircraft slumped over the controls. It then crashed, and a rescue team was sent to the site, but there was no sign of the pilot, and all they could find was a diary that indicated the plane was stationed on the island of Mindanao, some 1,300 miles away in the Pacific Ocean. A mystery for sure, but it was maybe one that was inspired by a work of fiction. The story is a whole lot similar to the first chapter of a book called Damn the Glory, written by Brigadier General and flying ace Robert Lee Scott, who pivoted from fighter pilot to fiction writer after World War II. Does art imitate life, or does life imitate art? When a legend picks up steam, it's kind of hard to tell the difference. The battle stopped by a meteor. Sometimes the heavens sends us signs. Maybe you're into astrology and explain how you feel lethargic because, of course, Mercury is in retrograde. As you wish. But if a meteor nearly falls on your head, and it's over 2,000 years ago, and you believe in gods that throw lightning bolts, you might want to reevaluate some parts of your life and the decisions you're making. This is basically what happened during the Third Mithridatic War. The war was a spat between Rome and the Kingdom of Pontus in Asia Minor and was fought between 73 BC and 63 BC. It was a pretty standard war as far as wars go, until a meteor entered the mix. According to Plutarch, a Greek historian and biographer, the incident occurred during the Battle of Phrygia in 72 BC. The Roman army, led by Lucius Licinius Lucullus, probably saying that 3 times fast, was battling it out with the Pontic army, led by King Mithridates VI. The battle was going, well, like a battle. People were being impaled and punctured and shot with arrows, but then apparently the cosmos decided to intervene. At one point, a meteor suddenly crashed down from the sky and landed in the middle of the battlefield. The impact was so powerful that it created a big old crater and a dust cloud that enveloped the entire area. Both armies were reportedly stunned and confused by the sudden appearance of the meteor, and the battle was immediately halted. According to some accounts, the Romans interpreted the meteor as a sign from the gods that they should stop fighting, while others saw it as a bad omen and a sign of impending disaster. Mithridates, on the other hand, reportedly saw the meteor as a sign of his imminent victory and later pressed his advantage. It wasn't a sign of his imminent victory, unfortunately for Mithridates. He eventually lost the war and Rome took control of his kingdom. According to another Greek historian named Appian, Mithridates later tried to take poison but had built up a tolerance for various poisons by taking tiny doses of it to guard against assassination attempts. So instead, he asked one of his bodyguards to run him through with a sword, which was more effective. What other battle mysteries do you know about? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Tudor England was a roller coaster of an era. You had Henry VII come in and start eliminating public land, which many attribute to being the first step in establishing capitalism. You had Henry VIII come in and split from the Catholic Church so he could divorce his wife. You had Bloody Mary come in after that and rapidly pivot back to Catholicism. Here are some of the creepiest mysteries of Tudor England. The Princes of the Tower. The disappearance of the deposed child King Edward V and his brother Richard, often referred to as the Princes in the Tower, remains one of the creepiest and high-profile mysteries in English history. In 1483, following the death of their father, King Edward IV, the young boys were placed in the Tower of London by their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, supposedly so Edward could prepare for his coronation as the king. They were never seen again, and no one has yet figured out what happened. After the death of Edward IV, a power struggle ensued between Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, and the boy's mother's family, the Woodvilles. Richard had plans to take the throne for himself, and the sneaky bugger, is that British enough for you? The sneaky bugger had Parliament declare the marriage between Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville invalid, and their kids, the young Ed and Rich, illegitimate. He then claimed the throne for himself as Richard III. The young princes, who were 12 and 9, were placed under Richard's protection, still in the Tower of London, but then, poof. At first, there wasn't much thought given to what happened to the boys. But as time passed, rumors began to circulate. Speculation grew, fueled by the controversial reign of Richard III and his pretty quick ousting after his defeat in the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. After Henry Tudor's victory and ascension to the throne as Henry VII, stories started to emerge that Richard III had ordered the murder of the young princes to secure his hold on power. The main source for this theory is the account written by Sir Thomas More, who was born several years after the events. More claimed that Richard III had ordered the hit, alleging that they were smothered with a pillow. But More's account might be a bit biased. He was a Tudor sympathizer, writing during the reign of Henry VIII, and given Henry's tendency to remove the heads of people who crossed him, More probably wanted some brownie points for painting Richard III in a negative light. Then, in 1674, during the reign of Charles II, a renovation of the Tower of London revealed 2 small skeletons buried under a staircase. At the time, it was widely believed that these were the remains of the princes in the tower. The skeletons were reburied in Westminster Abbey, and a monument was put up to commemorate them. Mystery solved, right? Well, the bones were re-examined in the 20th century, and the results were inconclusive. They couldn't say for sure that they belonged to little Edward and Richard. The skeletons were apparently too small to come to a conclusion. Too small? Hey, size matters. Also, the remains haven't been subjected to modern DNA testing to confirm their identities. The mystery surrounding the disappearance of Edward V and Richard remains unsolved, and various theories and alternative explanations have been put forward. While the Richard III offing them theory is still probably most likely, others have floated theories that they were secretly smuggled out of the tower and lived a life in hiding, or that they simply died from illness. Henry VIII's mysterious will. You know, with all the mystery and controversy and bloodshed that surrounded the court of Henry VIII during his lifetime, one of the strangest mysteries of all came after he died. His last will and testament has been the center of endless debate over the years. Debate that's been endless because of the fact that the original copy has been lost. First of all, Henry VIII's will went through multiple revisions and alterations. They all were made during the very last days of his life, when his mental and physical health were slipping away fast. The changes introduced uncertainties and contradictions that left room for different interpretations of things. It's thought that Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Thomas Seymour, brother of Jane Seymour, they were pretty involved in shaping the final version of the document to advance their own political agendas. Both were prominent Protestant reformers who were looking to secure their own positions and advance the Protestant cause. Their involvement has raised questions about their motivations and where they manipulated the document to serve their own interest. Another controversial aspect of Henry's will was the issue of succession. By bypassing his daughters Mary and Elizabeth, who were the eldest, and instead going with his young son Edward as his heir, Henry departed from the traditional line of succession. The decision was seen as favoring Protestant interests and securing the Protestant direction of the English Reformation. The exclusion of Mary, who was a devout Catholic, also created a whole lot of conflict down the line when she eventually became the Queen. The alterations in Henry's will had significant legal and constitutional implications too. The document established a precedent for monarchs to exert their will over the line of succession, bypassing the traditional order. It also raised questions about the authority of Parliament in matters of succession and the extent to which a monarch could dictate the future of the kingdom. But suspicions of tampering with the will and the crazy butterfly effects that they had for the next century, which was marked by ongoing tensions between Catholics and Protestants, may never be proven because the original copy was lost. Don't drink the soup. If you were around during the reign of Henry VIII, you might not have wanted to drink the soup made by a cook named Richard Roos, or maybe it was fine. We still aren't sure whether this obscure cook deserved one of the most horribly ironic death sentences in the history of death sentences. In fact, Anne Boleyn herself might have ordered it. The trial and execution of Richard Roos in 1531 was a bubbling pot of speculation and exaggerated justice. Roos was accused of poisoning the soup of John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, a staunch Catholic who was very much opposed to Henry VIII's efforts to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn. The trial and subsequent execution of Roos were politically charged and served as a warning to anyone who dared to challenge the king's authority. Richard Roos was a cook in Fisher's household. In February 1531, Roos allegedly poisoned a pot of porridge or soup that was then served up to the bishop and several other people at the house. Now, for some reason, Fisher didn't eat that day, but about 17 other people did, and for 2 of them, it was the last meal they ever ate. Sure hope that soup was at least good. Upon discovering the poisoning, the authorities arrested Roos, who was later put on trial for his alleged crime. The trial took place in March 1531 at the Guildhall in London. Roos was charged with high treason, as poisoning someone to death was retroactively made an act of treason against the king. And by retroactively, I mean that Henry VIII, apparently quite afraid of being poisoned himself, literally issued a decree that made the act treason while Roos was awaiting trial. A trial that would never come to court. There were apparently witnesses who claimed that Roos had confessed to the crime, and others who testified about the effects of the poisoning. Roos, on the other hand, claimed that he thought the white powder he put in the soup was a laxative and was meant to be a joke. The thing is, though, Roos never testified. We don't know if he ever really said this. There's also speculation that he wasn't even the cook in the bishop's household. And like I said, there wasn't even a trial. Crazy, huh? Henry had pushed the whole case through quickly, suspiciously quickly, equating murder with treason against the king, which helped him out a lot in the years to come, when he used this new precedent to end anyone who opposed him. In the end, the ultimate joke was on Roos. He was found guilty of treason and he was sentenced to a gruesome, very rare, unusual, and ironic form of punishment. He was to be boiled alive. The soup poisoner quite literally became the main ingredient in his own soup. On April 15, 1532, Roos was taken to Smithfield, a public punishment site in London. They had those back then. A large cauldron was filled with boiling water, and Roos was submerged in it. It took 2 hours, and he was reportedly dumped 3 times. Like a donut. Then there's the idea that Anne Boleyn or members of her family ordered the hit and set Roos up. The bishop was opposed to Anne marrying Henry after all, and getting him out of the way would have been beneficial to her becoming the queen. It would also explain Henry's crazy reaction to the whole event. Was he trying to cover something up? No evidence of Anne's involvement has ever been uncovered, but the speculation has persisted over the centuries. Elizabethan plots. When Elizabeth I came to power in 1558 and started doing everything in her power to make England Protestant again, there were a lot of Catholics who were not happy. Bloody Mary had tried her bloodiest to punish as many Protestants as possible during the previous 5 years. But Elizabeth I was a Protestant and swung to the other extreme soon after her coronation. What followed was a crazy series of attempts on her life, many of which were, in part, orchestrated by the Catholic Church and the Jesuits in particular. 4 of the most famous plots were the Babington plot, the Ridolfi plot, the Throckmorton plot, and one called the Essex coup. I mean, it's a miracle that Elizabeth made it past her coronation. Elizabeth herself claimed that there were hundreds of plots to take her out, many of them allegedly planned by Jesuits. First up in our long line of attempts on Elizabeth's life, we have the Ridolfi plot. The event was named after Robert Ridolfi, an Italian banker and merchant who was the main player in an attempt to dethrone Elizabeth I and replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots. Ridolfi had been moving in the shadows during the late 1560s and early 70s. traveling between Rome, Brussels, and Madrid, and acting as a messenger between Mary and the Catholic powers in Europe. Mary had been forced to abdicate the Scottish throne because of her Catholic leanings, which Elizabeth didn't like. She was also trying to claim the English throne, another thing that Elizabeth wasn't feeling at all. As a result, Mary spent a whole lot of time in Scottish and English prisons and, planning to kill the Queen. The plan involved an invasion by Spanish forces and a rebellion by English Catholics. But the theory was exposed in 1571, thanks in large part to Elizabeth's spymaster, Francis Walsingham, who was able to intercept and decode a bunch of encrypted letters being sent between Mary, Rodolphe, and their plotters, who included Catholic higher-ups and even the King of Spain. In 1571, Walsingham caught one of the messengers, a Flemish papal agent named Charles Bailey. Papal agents, by the way, were basically like Catholic spies that the Pope authorized to sow chaos and dissent all over Europe against anyone not being Catholic enough. After punishing Bailey on something called the rack, a very sweet and not at all painful device that slowly pulls your limbs apart, Bailey spilled the beans about the cipher, and he was thrown in jail. But surprisingly, he was not killed. Soon after, Rodolphe was arrested and imprisoned. Also surprisingly, he was saved from many punishments that were loved back then. Then came the Throckmorton plot. This one was led by Francis Throckmorton and involved another Catholic theory against Elizabeth. Throckmorton, a prominent Catholic sympathizer, wanted to overthrow Elizabeth by killing her and replacing her with Mary, Queen of Scots. This plot involved the coordination of a French invasion and support from the Catholic nobility in England. But the theory was uncovered in 1583 thanks to the efforts of Sir Francis Walsingham's network of spies. Throckmorton was arrested, interrogated, and sent to death for treason. Then a few years later in 1586, there was the Babington plot, named after the nobleman Anthony Babington. It was yet another theory to assassinate Elizabeth and install Mary on the English throne. Are you seeing a pattern here? Babington, who was obviously a Catholic, was persuaded by Jesuit priests and papal agents to participate in the plot. The scheme involved yet another plan to invade England, and this time they switched back to trying to get the Spanish to do it instead of the French. But the plot was uncovered yet again by Elizabeth's intrepid spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham. But he better have gotten a raise. Babington and his co-plotters were arrested, tried for treason, and subsequently punished. A year later, Mary, Queen of Scots, would meet the same fate. Once Mary was out of the picture, you'd think their attempts on Elizabeth's life would have slowed down, but apparently they didn't. The Essex plot, or Essex Rebellion, occurred in 1601 and involved the Earl of Essex, a guy named Robert Devereux. Essex was a former favorite of Elizabeth who fell out of favor and became unhappy with the Queen's policies. In an attempt to gain more power, Essex gathered a group of supporters and attempted a rebellion against Elizabeth's government. The rebellion, it failed, and Essex was captured, tried, and sent to death for treason. Elizabeth I probably had more lives than a cat, and she can thank the fact that she died of illness at the age of 69 instead of at the gallows or because of a punctured wound from her spy master extraordinaire, Sir Francis Walsingham. Monastery Mysteries. The reign of Henry VIII was also marked by the widespread destruction of the monasteries across the kingdom, and with them the loss of some pretty valuable relics and manuscripts. One of the most famous mysteries is the legend of the Glastonbury thorn. That's a type of hawthorn tree that was said to have sprung miraculously from the staff of Joseph of Arimathea upon his arrival in Glastonbury. The tree apparently only bloomed twice a year, during Christmas and Easter. It was clearly aware of Jesus. But after the dissolution of the monasteries, including Glastonbury Abbey in the 1530s, the Glastonbury thorn vanished. While some cuttings were preserved and replanted, the original tree disappeared. The dissolution of the monasteries involved the seizure and dispersal of tons of valuable religious relics and treasures that had been accumulated within their walls over the centuries. Many of these items, including saintly relics and artifacts, were lost or destroyed. The fate of these relics and treasures is often the subject of speculation, with some suggesting that they were sold, melted down, or simply lost over time. And who doesn't love a good secret chamber? Some monks or nuns who resisted the dissolution or tried to protect sacred items and manuscripts went into hiding. It's thought that some hidden chambers and secret passages were dug out within the monastic buildings to hide valuable items. The exact locations of these hiding places remains unknown, and a lot of treasures and relics might still lie undiscovered. The Vanished Colony. In the late 16th century, during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, England was trying to establish colonies in the New World. In 1585, a group of settlers led by Sir Walter Raleigh established the English colony of Roanoke Island off the coast of present-day North Carolina. This initial settlement struggled and the colonists eventually returned to England. In 1587, another attempt was made to establish a permanent colony on Roanoke Island, known as the Lost Colony. This group of about 115 settlers, including men, women, and children, arrived under the leadership of John White. But almost as quickly as he arrived, White had to go back to England to seek out more supplies and support. He left behind his pregnant wife, Eleanor Dare, and a Native American ally named Chief Manteo. When White returned to Roanoke Island 3 years later, everyone had vanished. The only clue was the word Croatoan carved into a post and crow etched into a tree. Maybe, just maybe, he thought, they had journeyed inland to a place called Croatoan, Chief Manteo's homeland near present-day Cape Hatteras on the Outer Banks. But before he could conduct a search, a hurricane blew in, damaging his ships and forcing him to return to England. He'd never be back. White couldn't raise enough money to finance another trip, and the search mission fell into the hands of Sir Walter Raleigh. The explorer wasn't very interested in finding the colonists, though. If they continued to be declared missing instead of dead, he could keep his legal claim on Virginia. When he did sail over to North America in 1595, he said he was searching for the colonists, but what he was really searching for was the legendary El Dorado. He wanted to strike it rich. He sailed by the Outer Banks without even stopping to have a look. So we still don't know what happened to the lost colony. However, the discovery of a new lead in 2012 involving a map painted by John White could provide some clues. The map in question is called La Vernia Pars. It looks like your standard, not-so-accurate 16th century map of the New World, but hidden within it, in invisible ink, are the outlines of 2 forts. These hidden fort outlines offer a potential clue about the fate of the Roanoke colonists. One of the forts is about 50 miles west of Roanoke Island, which aligns pretty well with the distance the colonists had reportedly planned to move, according to John White's writings. This discovery suggests that the colonists may have up and moved there. The inclusion of invisible ink on the map was probably a measure taken by White to safeguard information about the colonies from potential Spanish spies. During this period, England and Spain were fighting a lot over who could steal the most land from the Native Americans. There was all kinds of spycraft going on. Spain reportedly even created a fake plan to destroy the Roanoke colony, which they then leaked to the British as a kind of misdirection campaign. White clearly didn't want Spanish agents to get their hands on a map that showed the location of 2 British forts. Still though, the map doesn't prove anything. Maybe the colonists moved to one of these forts, but it's also quite possible that they were taken out by Native Americans. The Virginia colonists weren't exactly buddy-buddy with many of the tribes. Henry's missing wives. Henry VIII did have 6 wives, so can you blame him for forgetting where 2 of them were buried? Well, that's not exactly what happened, but the remains of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, 2 out of the 6, respectively, have been lost to history, and like all those attempts on Elizabeth I's life, religion might be the culprit. Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, was famously demeloned in 1536 on charges of adultery, treason, and jumping on the bed with her brother. After her killing at the Tower of London, she was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the Tower grounds, but nobody seems to know where exactly. There are a few reasons for the unfortunate loss of Anne Boleyn's remains. First, during the English Reformation, Henry VIII's Protestant regime tried really hard to suppress anything Catholic, which included the veneration of saints and relics. This led to the destruction of monastic institutions and the desecration of their associated burials, including Anne Boleyn's resting place. Second, during the reign of Henry's daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, who was also Anne Boleyn's daughter, there was a concerted effort to distance the monarchy from the controversial and scandalous legacy of her mother. Conveniently forgetting where her grave could have been was a good way to help out that cause. Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's 5th wife, was also separated from her head in 1542 on charges of adultery and treason, reportedly in the very same spot where Anne met her maker. After her death, her body was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula alongside Anne Boleyn. But just like Anne, the precise location of Catherine's grave within the chapel is unknown. The chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula also underwent some renovations and repairs over the centuries, which may have disturbed or displaced the remains buried within. Time, plus the lack of accurate records, plus Henry VIII simply not really caring about the wives he very clearly wasn't fond of, further contributed to the loss of their final resting places. Despite efforts over the years by historians and archaeologists to locate and identify the graves of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, including exploratory work within the Tower of London, their remains are still a mystery. Elizabeth's dead friend. The mysterious death of Amy Robsart, the wife of a guy named Robert Dudley and a close friend of Queen Elizabeth I, proved that while Elizabeth might have been able to escape a lot of attempts on her life, some of her friends and allies weren't so lucky. Amy Robsart's death occurred on September 8, 1560, at Cumnor Place, the residence she was staying at in Oxfordshire, England. Her demise was an unfortunate one. It was basically the Tudor-era version of the staircase. On the day of her death, Amy Robsart was found at the bottom of a flight of stairs in Cumnor Place, apparently having suffered a fatal fall. The circumstances surrounding her demise sparked a whole lot of suspicion and raised questions about foul play. Given her close association with Elizabeth I's favorite courtier, Robert Dudley, and the political climate of the time, theories and rumors quickly started swirling. Many suggested that Amy's death was a result of a theory to remove her from the scene, allowing Robert Dudley to pursue a romantic relationship with Queen Elizabeth I. Those in the Dudley did it camp said he would have been motivated by his desire for power and influence, and may have orchestrated Amy's death to clear the path for his royal ambitions. But no direct evidence linking Dudley to Amy's staircase tumble has ever been found, and the official investigation at the time concluded that her demise was accidental. The circumstances surrounding Amy Robsart's death and the subsequent speculation it generated have inspired numerous works of fiction, including Sir Walter Scott's novel Kenilworth. These fictional retellings often depict her death as a murder, driven by jealousy and political intrigue. What other creepy Tudor mysteries do you want to learn about? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more nutty history. Napoleon, the general turned dictator who subjugated Spain, parts of Italy, Germany, Poland, and a few other territories, is a guy who's gotten a lot of press. He was short, right? Towering at 5'6", he was actually a bit taller than your average 19th century Frenchman. Mystery solved. But here are some creepier mysteries about the French general that still have historians scratching their heads. A mysterious death. As Napoleon sat stewing in his defeat following his disastrous battle at Waterloo in 1815, there were supposedly a lot of people looking to set him free and unleash him back on Europe so he could try to finish what he started. As a result, his imprisonment on the remote island of St. Helena had some of the tightest security in the history of, well, imprisonment. The island was 1,200 miles from land and patrolled relentlessly by British ships. The British even set up garrisons on nearby islands. Islands, by the way, that were still 1,000 miles away from St. Helena. Because there were so many plots to break Napoleon out of his island prison, there have been rumors that the little dictator was taken out intentionally while sitting in his jail cell. Although the official cause of death recorded in his death certificate was stomach cancer, a few theories and controversies have emerged over the years that suggest otherwise. One of the most intriguing is ratsbane poisoning. The main culprit could have been a guy named Count Montholon. Montholon was a French general and confidant who joined Napoleon at St. Helena during his exile. Now, Napoleon trusted Montholon despite the fact that the French count probably wasn't a man who should have been trusted. Montholon was known for being a liar and an opportunist. He'd weaseled his way into a generalship, stolen money from troops, and in a lot of ways was not a stand-up guy. But Napoleon trusted him, and Montholon and his wife wound up accompanying Napoleon to St. Helena. The word was Montholon's wife was promiscuous. There were rumors that she and Napoleon had a good time behind Montholon's back. Other rumors were that she had a fling with one of Napoleon's British guards. Now, at the very least, this could be a good reason to take someone's life, at least from Montholon's perspective. But Montholon reportedly remained by Napoleon's side to the end. His wife left the little island prison after about 6 months, but the Count stayed behind, writing passionate love letters to her, despite the fact that they weren't really reciprocated. But Napoleon appreciated the Count, and he appreciated him a lot. So much so that just 3 weeks before his demise, Napoleon wrote a whole new will with Montholon as the main beneficiary. After Napoleon's death, the now wealthy Count bought a hotel in Paris and embarked on a bunch of unsuccessful business ventures until he basically went bankrupt by the beginning of the 1830s. You know, money can do strange things to people. Was Montholon slowly poisoning his king with ratsbane and cozying up to him in order to squeeze him from his fortune? The theory gained traction when a lock of Napoleon's hair was analyzed in 1961 and found that it did in fact contain pretty high levels of ratsbane. But later studies and re-examinations of the hair samples have yielded inconclusive results, leading to ongoing debates among experts. There are also theories that say Napoleon was actually taking ratsbane on purpose as a way to build up his immunity in case someone actually did try to poison him. Smart. Lost treasure. Napoleon's push into Russia in 1812 was a bad move. A combination of brutal winter and guerrilla warfare tactics that the French just couldn't match ended up in disaster for Napoleon's men. Some say that of the 600,000 troops that crossed into the not yet Iron Curtain, only a fraction got out alive. It's possible that nearly 500,000 French troops lost their lives that year. They might have lost a rumored 80 tons of treasure too. As the French army made its desperate retreat, quite a few soldiers apparently had sacks full of looted Moscow valuables. Honestly, I'm surprised they had the strength to carry anything other than their icy beards, given the sorry state of their army at the time. But hey, let's speculate about lost treasure, right? Rumors began circulating that Napoleon's troops had amassed a pretty significant stockpile of wealth during the occupation of Moscow. The soldiers carried out your standard wartime looting practices, taking precious metals, jewelry, artwork, and other valuables from the city's aristocratic houses, palaces, and churches. And they were able to do all this looting because the Russians simply let them have the city, burned most of it before they left, took all the food supplies, and waited for the French to starve, freeze, and go away. Napoleon's army might have found some nice Muscovite necklaces, but what they really needed were some potatoes and a blanket or two. Still though, rumors of a substantial Napoleon treasure have persisted, and many think that the army hid it somewhere during their retreat from Moscow. One possible location is Lake Semlivo, near Smolensk, which was named as a potential site by a guy named Philippe de Ségur, who was a member of Napoleon's staff. Ségur's claim had a bit of truth to it. Later, a whole lot of arms and ammunition were found abandoned near the lake, but no treasure. But some historians and treasure hunters have suggested that Ségur's story was fabricated to hide the true location of the loot. One theory proposes that the treasure was abandoned somewhere along the banks of the river Berezina, a theory based on the fact that Napoleon's army fought a battle there, trying to fend off the advancing Russian army during their retreat. Another theory, championed by a guy named Vyacheslav Ryskov, claims that the treasure was taken further south and hidden in Lake Bolshaya Rudovich in Belarus. Ryskov's theory is based on local accounts of a walkway that was built in the lake in 1812, a walkway that has since eroded away. After doing some tests, he found that the water had a curiously high concentration of silver ions. Evidence for treasure? So far, nothing has been found. Napoleon's haunting. Was Napoleon haunted by the ghost of one of his former generals? Well, according to this next mystery, he might have been so haunted that he called out his name as he lay dying in prison on St. Helena. The story goes like this. General Henri Christian Michel d'Estaingel had a bad dream, and so just before the Battle of Marengo in June 1800, he approached Napoleon with an envelope containing his will and requested the emperor act as his killer. Stengel claimed to have had a vivid dream in which he saw himself rushing into battle, encountering an enormous Croatian warrior in armor who then transformed into an image of death. This dream left Stengel convinced that he would perish in the upcoming conflict, hence the will and all that. The following day, Napoleon reportedly received a report confirming the death of Stengel in battle, specifically mentioning that he had been killed by a large Croatian warrior. The strange coincidence of Stengel's dream aligning with the circumstances of his death is said to have haunted Napoleon throughout his life, and it is believed to have influenced his final words on his deathbed at St. Helena. Stengel, hurry! Attack! The only problem with the story, though, is that Stengel apparently died in a battle 4 years earlier. Napoleon didn't mention Stengel shortly before dying, but his name probably wasn't in his last sentence. A couple of days before Napoleon succumbed to his cancer or to his ratsbane poisoning, depending on which story you believe, he mentioned his name along with some of his other comrades while having some sort of fever dream. Napoleon was definitely a superstitious man. He had a lucky star that he'd searched for in the sky. He reportedly refused to travel on Fridays, or if it was the 13th. Friday the 13th was probably completely off limits. He was obsessed with omens and signs. One of the strangest might be a phantom who came to visit him from time to time, known as the Red Man. There are a few accounts of Napoleon meeting up with this mysterious Red Man at different significant points in his life, including before major battles or important decisions. The Red Man is described as a spectral figure dressed in red or crimson clothing who appears as a harbinger or omen of things to come. It's said that the Red Man would provide Napoleon with guidance or warnings, influencing his actions and shaping his strategic decisions. One account says the Red Man advised the French dictator to stay out of Russia. He clearly didn't listen. The thing is, though, that the Red Man made cameos to a few different French rulers over the years, and was said to haunt the French palace of Tuileries. He showed up at critical moments during the lives of Catherine de' Medici, Henry IV, and Louis XIV, so Napoleon wasn't that special. The poisoning. There are rumors that Napoleon was poisoned on St. Helena, but there are also rumors that Napoleon did his fair share of poisoning as well. In May 1799, Napoleon's forces found themselves besieged in the town of Jaffa during their campaign in Egypt. When it became necessary for Napoleon to retreat, he made arrangements for transporting the wounded soldiers in order that those suffering from disease should be left behind to prevent anything nasty from spreading around within his own ranks. The story goes that Napoleon told the doctor in charge, a guy named Nicolas de Jeannette, that it would be more humane to euthanize the sick men with Auntie rather than abandoning them to the Turkish Mamluk forces, who were known for their brutal treatment of prisoners. However, de Jeannette refused to carry out the suggestion. Thwarted by the good doctor, Napoleon didn't off his own troops and instead left a rear guard to protect the sick soldiers, hoping they'd be rescued by the advancing English forces that the French were fighting. But apparently the Mamluks were a bit more ruthless. It was a good move, I guess. Some of the men were indeed saved by the English after the retreat. But the incident was a bad look for Napoleon. Rumors started to circulate, amplified by French officers and soldiers captured by the enemy, suggesting that Napoleon had personally ordered the poisoning of hundreds of men in Jaffa. Napoleon railed against these accusations for the rest of this reign. He even commissioned this painting showing him nobly visiting the sick troops in Jaffa to help show everyone what a good guy he was. Napoleon's death mask. Funeral masks or death masks have been around for millennia. The ancient Egyptians made them. One of the most famous is King Tut's golden funerary mask. In ancient Rome, aristocrats would have molds of their faces made while they were still alive so they could be made into statues after they passed away. Makes sense. Napoleon also had a death mask made. But the circumstances behind how it was made and where it ended up are veiled in mystery. When Napoleon kicked the bucket while in prison at St. Helena, there were a few people surrounding his deathbed. One of them was a French doctor named Francois Carlo Antomarchi. Another was a British surgeon named Francis Burton. One of them made a cast of the French emperor's face, and honestly, look at it. Maybe it's the fact that Napoleon was gaunt and wasted away when he died, but he kind of looks better than those pudgy paintings of him we're used to seeing. Anyway, one of these doctors made a cast, but we're not sure who. Some say that Dr. Antomarchi was the guy who cast the original mold, called a parent mold. Others say it was Dr. Burton. In the Dr. Burton made it version, his cast was apparently stolen by a woman named Madame Bertrand, who was one of Napoleon's attendants while he was in prison. Madame Bertrand reportedly broke off some pieces of the mask and left the British doctor with only the ears and a piece of the back of Napoleon's head. Burton then tried to sue Madame Bertrand, but the lawsuit failed. Bertrand wound up selling a copy of the mask to Dr. Antomarchi, who eventually moved to Cuba. It's said that one of these first copies still sits in the Museum of Santiago de Cuba. Dr. Antomarchi also made his way up to New Orleans, a city with a ton of French heritage. But in the chaos of the Civil War, the mask disappeared, but was saved in the nick of time by a city treasurer while it was being taken to the dump. Yet another copy has ended up in a museum attached to the University of North Carolina. But just how original these casts are is still a mystery, given all the unknowns surrounding the original. The plan to give Napoleon South America. History unfolded a little differently. A lot of people in South America could today be speaking French, and Napoleon might have been the emperor of a massive South American empire that spanned Chile, Argentina, and Peru. Sir Thomas Cochrane had one of the most audacious prison break plans in history. Cochrane was a British naval officer and adventurer, a guy who earned the nickname El Diablo in South America, and the Sea Wolf by Napoleon and the French. He was an impressive naval tactician, despite the fact that he had to flee the UK in 1814 after he was accused of manipulating the stock market for his own personal gain. He ended up gaining Chilean citizenship and played a big part in the revolutions in Chile and Peru that saw them become independent from Spain. Then he moved over to Brazil and helped lead their navy in their fight for independence from the Portuguese. But before all that, on his way over to South America from London with the Chilean ambassador who recruited him for the job, Cochrane had an idea. Napoleon had just recently been sent to St. Helena. Why not make a little detour, break the little dictator out of jail, and set him up to rule a unified South American empire that could potentially become one of the most powerful in the world? Cochrane figured that by freeing Napoleon and placing him at the head of a powerful South American empire, he could mess with the European balance of power and establish a new order in the region. He was also probably spurred on by the fact that his homeland had basically bankrupted him and imprisoned him for a bit because of his less savory business endeavors. Installing Britain's enemy one as the head of a sparkly new South American superpower would be great payback. Unfortunately for Cochrane, the Chileans on board the ship were not on board with this plan. They didn't make the detour and Napoleon wasn't busted out of jail. But imagine if it became true. Now that's a question I need answered. Broken nose? Napoleon's campaign into Egypt was relentless. He and his army laid waste to the legendary Mamluk army that had wrestled control of Egypt away from the Ottoman Empire. During the Battle of the Pyramids, Napoleon's army bombarded Egypt with cannon fire, and in the process, denosed the famous Sphinx. Well, that's how the legend goes, anyway. The problem, though, is that this probably never happened. The best evidence against Napoleon's role in the mysterious disappearance of the Sphinx's nose is an oil painting by Danish naval captain and explorer Frederick Louis Norden. The painting, which he created a few decades before Napoleon ever went to northern Africa, shows the Sphinx noseless. Need more proof? There are some other historical accounts and depictions from various sources predating Napoleon's expedition that depict the Sphinx without its nose. For example, French scholar Dominique Vivant Dinal created a sketch of the Sphinx in 1798 during Napoleon's campaign, showing the monument without a nose. Now, as far as I know, no one got a good sketch of Napoleon or one of his generals sending a cannonball into the Sphinx's face. Then there's the Arab historian al-Makrizi, who lived in the 14th and 15th centuries. A few hundred years before Napoleon was ever born, he noticed that the Sphinx didn't have a nose. What do you think? Was Napoleon the reason why the Sphinx was noseless? Fake Napoleon. But if you believe the story of a guy simply named Emil Mercer, Napoleon in prison wasn't really Napoleon at all. It was a fake Napoleon who was somehow swapped out to take his place in St. Helena, while the real Napoleon donned a fake beard and fled to Italy to sell glasses. What? In 1911, Emil Mercer, a gentleman from France, unveiled a fascinating claim regarding Napoleon Bonaparte's exile and fate. According to Mercer's account, Napoleon's journey to St. Helena was a ruse, as he arranged for a look-alike named Francois-Eugene Robuch to take his place. Mercer contended that Napoleon, seeing that Robuch looked a whole lot like himself, orchestrated a switch that would make any stunt double blush. Robuch, somehow agreeing to the scheme, ended up on the remote island of St. Helena to waste away the last 6 years of his life and die under dubious circumstances. The real Napoleon, meanwhile, got himself a long fake beard and escaped to Verona, Italy, where he established a modest shop specializing in selling spectacles to British travelers. But Napoleon could never be content merely selling spectacles. He still wanted to be the king of Europe. Driven by his unrelenting ambition, Napoleon hatched a daring plan to reclaim power. He snuck back to France and tried to infiltrate the imperial palace, where his unsuspecting son now reigned as king. Unfortunately for the real Napoleon, a vigilant sentry discovered him during the unauthorized break-in. Refusing to reveal his true identity or explain his presence, Napoleon met a tragic fate when the sentry, unaware of the significance of the man before him, ended him on the spot. It's a wild story, and unfortunately one that has absolutely no proof to back it up. But you gotta admire the dedication of this guy, Emil Mercer. He even got the story published in a Montreal newspaper in 1911. Finding Cleopatra? Did Napoleon find Cleopatra's tomb? Napoleon's campaign in Egypt, which took place from 1798 to 1801, aimed to establish French influence in the region and disrupt British trade routes to India. The expedition included a whole contingent of scholars, scientists, and artists who documented and studied Egypt's ancient monuments, culture, and history. As a result of this wave of French brainpower being unleashed upon Egypt, a massive series of books, known as the Description of Egypt, was published. It was a monumental work that contained 23 volumes and around 10,000 pages. A light read. Ironically, the publication of the Description d'Egypte, as it's called in French, sparked a wave of fascination and Egyptomania throughout Europe. Attention that, while captivating the imaginations of people all over the world and sparking what became known as Egyptmania, also led to widespread looting and the destruction of a whole lot of ancient Egypt's precious artifacts. The story goes that during his campaign, Napoleon allegedly discovered Cleopatra's tomb and ordered her remains to be brought back to France. According to the story, the remains were stored in the Louvre Museum in Paris, that is until around 1940, when a museum guard unknowingly dumped Cleopatra into a sewer. Uh-oh. Now the story has never been verified, but maybe it's the reason no one has ever found Cleo's tomb. Do you have any other strange facts about Napoleon? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe. There's dumb, and then there's dumb. You've all probably heard of the Darwin Award-style stupidity of people launching themselves off cliffs with homemade rocket cars, but there have been some incredibly dumb leaders and influential figures throughout history. Folks who have led armies into doomed battles, been dragged through forests by deer, and kicked the bucket on the toilet. And a lot of these dummies have some less than savory backstories. Here are creepy things you didn't know about the dumbest people in history. Basil's Wild Ride. It takes a certain kind of stupidity to somehow get your belt caught in the antlers of a deer while out hunting, and then get dragged 16 miles through the forest. But it also takes a scary kind of cutthroatedness. Is that a word? Savagery. Whatever. It takes a pretty mean person to off his own mentor and basically steal the throne of an empire for himself. Basil I, also known as Basil the Macedonian, ruled the Byzantine Empire from 1867 to 886 AD. He's been generally regarded by historians as a capable ruler who implemented some important reforms and stabilized the Byzantine Empire. But he was a pretty ruthless guy, and the way he died could have made it into the Darwin Awards. Basil initially served as a trusted advisor and friend to Michael III, who was the Byzantine emperor at the time. Michael III was no saint himself. There are accounts that he was a bit of a drunk. I mean, his nickname was Michael the Drunkard, so there's probably a good bit of truth to that. But despite his love of the sauce, Michael was apparently a pretty good mentor to Basil, who came from a poor background and rose to become one of the most powerful guys in Byzantium. Basil was an Armenian who moved from a small village in Thrace to Constantinople, where he began making a name for himself as a wrestler and horseman. His chariot skills eventually caught the eye of Michael, and the emperor eventually made Basil the guardian of the imperial bedroom. Now that's a funny sounding title that was actually quite important. From there, Basil went about persecuting anyone he saw as a threat to the emperor. He did such a good job that Michael eventually made him co-ruler of the empire. Pretty crazy and unprecedented move. At his coronation, Michael stated that it is my will that Basil, who is loyal to me and definitely won't have me punctured to death in 16 months, should be the guardian and manager of my empire and should be proclaimed by all as Basilius. Unfortunately for Michael, Basil wasn't happy with the co-part of the deal, and had Michael meet his maker a year and a half later while he was sleeping in his bed. You can almost taste the irony of Basil's initial guardian of the imperial bedroom title. But Basil's bad karma would come back to haunt him and drag him through a forest on the antlers of a deer. Check this out. One day, while out on a hunt, and I don't know how this is possible, but apparently it happened, Basil's belt got caught in the antlers of a deer. Maybe he shot the poor animal, and thinking it was dead, the emperor sauntered up to it to admire his work. But before he knew it, the deer was up, antlers up, its antlers snagged in Basil's trousers, and it pranced off through the woods, dragging Basil along for the ride, for 16 miles. He was eventually freed by an attendant who cut him loose with a knife. But Basil, always suspicious, thought the attendant may have had ulterior motives, and Basil had him killed shortly before the emperor succumbed to his own injuries and died in August of 886. The king who spawned tabloids. Tabloids are everywhere these days. Gossip about celebrities is all the rage. Who's seeing who? Why this relationship is falling apart? What scandalous thing did this person do? 20 reasons why you should drop everything and focus on why Gwyneth Paltrow named her daughter Apple. It just never ends. The whole tabloid industry got started in early 19th century England with a king so dumb that people simply couldn't look away. Let's just say King George IV wasn't frugal. His reign was characterized by extravagant indulgence and excessive spending on all kinds of personal luxuries, art, and architecture. He commissioned the Royal Pavilion in Brighton as basically his pleasure palace, known for its unique Indo-Saracenic architectural style typical of Britain's Indian colonialism. His lavish lifestyle and expensive taste earned him a less than savory reputation. One of the most infamous scandals during his reign was his troubled and highly publicized marriage to Caroline of Brunswick. The couple's relationship was pretty contentious from the start. They were married in 1795, but George IV was apparently repulsed by Caroline and refused to live with her. They lived separate lives, and their relationship quickly deteriorated. In 1820, when George IV ascended to the throne a few years after his father had been declared insane, he tried to divorce Caroline on the grounds that she committed adultery. He basically said something along the lines of, "You bimbo, you have had illegitimate child and doth be sleeping around throughout England." But the whole thing kind of backfired on the king, and his attempt to divorce Caroline turned into a public spectacle. Caroline was quite popular with the people, and her trials became widely followed by the public. In the end, the divorce proceedings failed because of the lack of evidence and the sympathy the public had for Caroline. The scandal surrounding the failed attempt to divorce Caroline severely damaged George IV's public image. He became increasingly isolated from the people and faced widespread criticism and ridicule. His reputation as a hedonistic and extravagant ruler, coupled with his failed personal life, didn't do much to help the monarchy's standing. And then came the tabloids. Advancements in printing tech and growing literacy rates led to the proliferation of newspapers catering to a wider audience. The newspapers of the time were often politically aligned and focused on reporting serious news and political discussions. But George and his escapades were like a bad movie you couldn't look away from, and the press quickly realized the commercial potential of catering to people who couldn't look away from bad movies. A new kind of journalism popped up. Newspapers started featuring sensational stories about the royals, including the king's relationships, his lavish lifestyle, and his controversies. These stories often had a gossipy and scandalous tone, appealing to readers' curiosity and desire for titillating information. Publishers recognized the commercial value of these stories, and newspapers began to compete with each other for readership by focusing on sensationalism, personal scandals, and celebrity gossip. This shift in approach led to a change in the tone and content of reporting, which laid the foundations for the development of the modern tabloid industry. Thanks a lot, George. Cannonball! You ever wanted to impress your significant other? What did you do? Buy some flowers? Take them out for a nice dinner? Maybe go on a trip somewhere exotic? Well, back in 15th century Scotland, one king wanted to impress his missus so badly that he ended up dying because of it. During his reign in the 15th century, James II was known for his passion for artillery and military tech. But things went a little too far. An unfortunate incident unfolded involving a cannonball and the king's legs. Now, according to the story, James II organized a demonstration of artillery capabilities as entertainment for his wife, Queen Mary. The event was meant to showcase the power and precision of cannons, highlighting their importance in warfare. Sexy, huh? During the demonstration, the king apparently stood too close to the cannons, disregarding safety precautions. Uh-oh. He was the king after all, and no lowly engineer or whoever was in charge of safety would ruin his day. Tragically, one of the cannons misfired or malfunctioned. The cannonball, instead of firing straight ahead, reportedly veered off course and struck the king, severing or severely injuring his legs. The injuries were so bad James II succumbed to them shortly after the incident. Now, I'm not sure how impressed Queen Mary was with that. Lord Cardigan's cardigan. First up, we have a guy who had a piece of clothing named after him. But despite people who think the cardigan may look dumb, Lord Cardigan's decisions during the Crimean War were even dumber. Lord Cardigan, whose full name was James Thomas Brunel, was a British military officer who was most notorious for his role in ordering the ill-fated charge of the Light Brigade during the Crimean War. The charge took place on October 25, 1854, during the Battle of Balaclava, and it didn't go well. I mean, we'll get into the guy's fashion sense off the battlefield and his promiscuities later, but first, war. It all started when Lord Cardigan, as the commander of the British cavalry, received ambiguous orders to attack Russian artillery positions. The British commander in the Crimean War, Lord Raglan, sent an order to Cardigan through a messenger. The order was to attack and prevent the Russians from removing captured British guns from a position known as the Causeway Heights. But like in a game of telephone played by kids who speak different languages, some words were left out or misunderstood, and the orders were missing some pretty crucial details. The order from Lord Raglan to Lord Cardigan went like this. Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front, follow the enemy, and try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. Troop horse artillery may accompany. French cavalry is on your left. So Lord Raglan basically wanted Lord Cardigan to launch an assault, despite his lack of commas and his vague sense of direction. Happy the French cavalry was on the left. But we might have a classic case of do shoot the messenger here. The guy tasked with delivering the order accidentally delivered a note that lacked the crucial phrase, "to the front," which clarified the intended direction of the charge. Without this pretty important piece of information, Lord Cardigan interpreted the order literally and understood it as a command to charge directly at the Russian artillery stationed at the end of the valley in front of them. The charge itself was a disaster. The Light Brigade had little chance of success against overwhelming Russian forces. The soldiers rode valiantly, but the attack resulted in heavy casualties. Out of around 670 men who participated in the charge, more than 270 were killed, wounded, or captured. The charge achieved very little in terms of its military objectives, and was widely criticized as a futile and poorly planned action. But just look at Cardigan, leading the charge on his horse Ronald, clueless about the fate that awaits his brigade. And just look at Cardigan's cardigan, flapping in the breeze, a majestic 1800s fashion statement that will live on long after the English lord. Well, alright, not entirely true. Cardigan didn't really wear his cardigan into battle, but his horse was named Ronald, and they both led and actually survived the ill-fated charge. But beyond his inept military decision-making, Lord Cardigan was also known for his eccentric fashion sense. He was often seen wearing extravagant and flamboyant outfits, which included brightly colored uniforms complete with accessorized hats. And of course, there were his famous knitted waistcoats. And beyond his fashion exploits, Lord Cardigan had an interesting personal life. He owned a yacht that he named the Lena, stationed in Balaclava during the Crimean War. Lord Cardigan oftentimes went ashore to seek the company of local women. I'm pretty sure they were turned on by his extravagant cardigans and his boat. Just picture Cardigan in nothing but swim trunks and a cardigan, wooing women on his yacht with stories about how he led one of the stupidest charges in history. The Drunk Pope. When you think of Pope, you probably think pious guy, white robes, fancy Pope-mobile, eloquent addresses from the Vatican, stuff like that. But this wasn't the case for Pope John XII. He took "thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife" to a whole new level. In 955 AD, Pope John XII ascended to CEO of Catholicism at the remarkably young age of 18. At the start of his papacy, John XII faced a lot of skepticism, both because of his young age and the fact that his election was probably influenced by his father, Alberic II, a Roman nobleman who kind of considered himself a self-stylized Prince of Rome, and had some pretty grand ambitions for his son. During his tenure, John XII developed a reputation for, let's say, indulgence. He would throw some pretty wild parties, drink in excess, have all kinds of affairs, and generally just engage in pretty un-pope-like behavior. John's frat boy version of Catholicism drew criticism from both within and outside the church. One of the significant events during his papacy was the strained relationship with Otto I, who would later become Emperor of Germany. John XII initially supported Otto's rival, Berengar II, which was kind of a dumb move. John and Berengar conspired against Otto to have him ousted. Now in response, Otto marched on Rome, captured the city, and convened a council in 963 that effectively deposed John XII from the papacy. Although he was technically still the pope, he really didn't care. John was off hunting in the mountains when Otto officially had him booted. Hopefully the trip went a bit better than Basil's. So John was basically free to keep partying and enjoying the company of women. But his lifestyle would soon catch up to him. According to the account of Luprand of Cremona, a medieval scholar, Pope John XII met a pretty drastic end while engaged in an adulterous encounter outside of Rome. Luprand, known for his colorful and sometimes sensationalist descriptions, suggests that John XII's demise was either the result of apoplexy, aka a stroke, or at the hands of an outraged husband. According to Luprand, Pope John XII was allegedly engaging in an illicit affair when he suffered a sudden stroke. This sudden health crisis could have been caused by things like high blood pressure or a ruptured blood vessel in the brain. Luprand's account implies that an intimate encounter was intense enough to trigger a fatal brain pop. A life of excess, a death of excess. Luprand also gives the possibility that John met a violent end at the hands of a vengeful husband. This version of events suggests that the Pope's adulterous actions provoked the wrath of a betrayed spouse, who got revenge for the infidelity. Apparently, John didn't read the Bible very closely. Caligula's absurdity. Caligula was a Roman emperor with a lot going on, and not in a good way. From getting far too close with his family members to appointing his horse to a high-ranking government position, to parading around with a seashell costume claiming he was the king of the ocean, here are the greatest hits of this monumental imbecilic emperor who reigned from 37 to 41 AD. Caligula was said to have had intimate relationships with all three of his sisters, Julia Livilla, Agrippina the Younger, and Drusilla. He was especially close with Drusilla, who was his favorite sister, and he was apparently very close with her from a very young age. Caligula was so obsessed with Drusilla that he had her deified after her death and built a temple in her honor. Caligula didn't just keep it in the family, though. He spread his love around with other women, both married and unmarried, and with other men. He became particularly fond of taking the wives of other senators and powerful men, a move that would in part lead to his assassination just 4 years after he became emperor. Some say Caligula even liked to dress up in women's clothing and get friendly with his male courtiers. From cruel to unusual, let's move to downright crazy. One of the most bizarre stories about Caligula is that he wanted to make his horse, Incitatus, a consul. Caligula was apparently really fond of his little horse buddy and treated it like royalty. He reportedly gave Incitatus a marble stable with an ivory manger, a jeweled collar, and even a housekeeper to look after him. The story goes that Caligula became so impressed with his horse's abilities that he considered appointing him as a consul, which was one of the highest positions in the Roman Republic. A consul was a top government official who shared power with the Roman Senate, and the idea of a horse holding such a position was obviously absurd. It's not certain how serious Caligula was about making Incitatus a consul or whether he was just pulling some weird Roman prank. But either way, it's become one of the most well-known examples of Caligula's alleged madness and eccentricity. But wait, there's more. In 39 AD, Caligula decided to lead a campaign to conquer Germanic tribes in the Rhine region. The campaign was a failure, though, and Caligula's soldiers refused to cross the river, causing Caligula to retreat back to Rome in disgrace. To compensate for his military failure, Caligula decided to stage a triumphal procession anyway, pretending that he'd been a great victorious leader. He ordered his troops to gather seashells from the English Channel, which he claimed were spoils of a great naval victory over the people of Britannia. He also ordered his soldiers to collect war booty, like helmets and armor, even though they had never even engaged in any battles. Caligula then paraded through the streets of Rome wearing a breastplate covered in seashells and declared himself the conqueror of the ocean. He also demanded that a triumphal arch be built in his honor, and he had statues erected of himself throughout the city. This imaginary war and triumphal procession were seen as signs of Caligula's increasing megalomania and delusions. 2 years later, he'd be assassinated. He'd alienated and ticked off so many people by that point that it seemed inevitable. Now it's unclear whether or not his horse was involved. Ponzi scheme. While Charles Ponzi didn't invent the Ponzi scheme, the fact that it's named after him is pretty telling. His robbing Peter to pay Paul scam netted him millions of dollars. Some reports say that at one point he was raking in $250,000 a day. But nothing lasts forever, and Ponzi's scheme very quickly blew up in his face. Oh, yeah, and also he was involved in trafficking people. Born in 1882 in Italy, Ponzi immigrated to the U.S. in 1903 and immediately was up to no good. He made his way up to Canada, where he was arrested and convicted for his involvement in a check forgery scheme in Montreal. Ponzi did 3 years in St. Vincent de Paul Penitentiary in Montreal from 1908 to 1911. When he was released in 1911, Ponzi was not rehabilitated. He got involved in another criminal endeavor, a scheme to smuggle Italian immigrants into the United States. At the time, there were strict immigration laws, and people were trying different things to circumvent them. Ponzi was reportedly part of a group involved in smuggling Italian immigrants across the border. But his stint as a smuggler was short-lived. Ponzi was arrested by authorities and subsequently convicted. He served about 2 years at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary from 1911 to 1913 for his role in the immigration smuggling operation. And when he got out, he moved to Boston, where he worked as a nurse at a mining camp and held some other odd jobs. Then he struck mental gold. Gold for him, at least. In the early 1920s, Ponzi claimed that he could take advantage of the price difference in international reply coupons, which were used for buying postage stamps. He promised investors super high returns of 50% within 45 days or 100% within 90 days. He eventually convinced thousands of people to invest their money with him, promising substantial profits. Think of it this way. There are special coupons that you can buy for a low price in one country and then exchange them for a higher value in another country. It's like buying a $1 coupon in one place and being able to exchange it for a $2 coupon in another place. Hey, that sounds pretty good. Now, a guy with a nice suit comes along and says, "Buongiorno, if you give me all of your money, I can invest in these coupons. Get them more money for them, and then you'll make a fantastic fortune." But obviously, the foundation of Ponzi's scheme was built on deceit. He used the money from new investors to pay off early investors, creating an illusion of successful returns. Ponzi's scheme relied entirely on the continuous influx of new investors to sustain itself. As long as more people invested, he could maintain the appearance of profitability. The scheme unraveled when investigative journalists started questioning the legitimacy of Ponzi's operations. In 1920, the Boston Post published an expose highlighting the unsustainable nature of his investment model. Now, because of that, panicked investors started demanding their money back, and Ponzi's fraudulent activities were revealed. Ponzi was arrested that same year and his notorious scheme collapsed, leaving a whole lot of investors financially devastated and seething mad. It's estimated that his investors lost a total of $20 million, around $207 million in today's money. 6 banks actually completely folded because of it. He was charged with 86 counts of mail fraud and faced life in prison. But white-collar criminals often get off pretty easy. The judge, Clarence Hale, gave a nice little speech before sentencing Ponzi, where he said, "It will not do to have the world understand that such a scheme as that can be carried out without receiving substantial punishment. But let's not go too crazy. It's not like he had a small amount of illicit substances on him or anything." 5 years. Ponzi ended up serving 3.5. He then got hit with more state charges in Massachusetts, 10 counts of larceny to be exact, and was found guilty and got 7 to 9 more years. He got out on bail though in 1925 while still appealing his case, and then immediately started a scam selling swampland in Florida. Yeah, alligators anyone? It was like selling apples to an apple farmer. He was caught trying that too. He was sent back to Massachusetts, where he served 7 more years in prison. Then he went back to Italy, tried his best to scheme some more, but he wasn't very successful. He lived out the last years of his life in Brazil, poor and in poor health. What other dumb people in history do you know about? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more nutty history.